Sorry. Hey, everybody. Thank you all so much for tuning in to Ideas on Tap. My name is Caroline Gillespie. I'm Program Officer at the Mississippi Humanities Council. Thank you all for tuning in to this program. We've missed y'all the last few months without having any Ideas on Taps, but realized that we needed to kind of hop back into it and kind of dive in with a really important conversation. So I will say thank you to everybody who is joining us for the first time. For those of you who have never participated in Ideas on Tap before, welcome. One of the silver linings of this pandemic is that geographic barriers are not so much a thing anymore. So people are able to participate in things that maybe they weren't able to do in person before. So, just because our panel is all from every different place in the state and nobody's in the same room. So we're excited to all be here. I do want to say thank you to all of our panelists. I'm going to do some very quick introductions. Tamika Simmons is actually an MHC board member. So we are very lucky to have her on our board. She is the director of the Local Government Leadership Institute at Delta State University and is a pro at doing virtual conversations just like this. So we're happy to have her here with us tonight. In the bottom left, we've got Scott Colomb, who is the district attorney for the 16th Circuit Court District of Mississippi. And disclaimer, he is actually a former MHC board member. And I will say that Scott's ideas about new ways to engage people with programs really led to us creating Ideas on Tap in the first place. So if it wasn't for Scott, we might not be here tonight and wouldn't have been here with y'all for the last couple of years. So we really appreciate Scott for kind of hanging on and really trying to get us to go into this type of program. So we thank Scott for being here. And then last, right below, is Cliff Johnson, who is the director of the MacArthur Justice Center at the University of Mississippi School of Law. And so I'm going to let them kind of introduce themselves a little bit more as we get into the conversation and what they're doing with their work and how it informs their views on tonight's topic. I want to say that we are missing a very important voice on the panel tonight. It's a little bit difficult to talk about policing and criminal justice without somebody from the law enforcement community. We have tried a multitude of people that might be able to participate in tonight's conversation that could kind of speak to those issues. And we were not able to secure anybody, but we hope that, that we can still have a really thoughtful conversation. And I will encourage, if there are any law enforcement officers out there who are viewing in, to drop your comments into the Facebook event onto the video. And we will definitely try to get to some of those questions later on. And I encourage everybody who's joining in, if you do have questions, to put them in the comments, and we will try to address some of those throughout the conversation as well as at the end. And I will say another disclaimer is that the ideas represented here tonight are not necessarily those of the Humanities Council. So we're very glad to have all of our panelists, but those ideas are not necessarily those of the Humanities Council. So everybody post your questions in the event video, and we'll try to get to them. And we will go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand it over to Tamika, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome everybody to Ideas on Tap. It's just super exciting to be able to have this conversation with our esteemed panelists. And I just want to thank the Mississippi Humanities Council for continuing the conversation, the programming of Ideas on Tap virtually. That's kind of the space we're in right now. And so we're just taking that on, head on to continue having important dialogues. And I want to thank, of course, again, our panelists who are joining us today and this evening. Today, we are tackling the topic of policing and criminal justice. And so what I'd like to do first is invite both of you, and I'll start with you, Scott, to talk a little bit about, give us a little bit of your background and the work that you do and how that connects with the conversation we're going to have today.
Yeah, so my name is Scott Colomb. I'm really excited to be a part of the panel. Excited that the Humanities Council invited me to be on this Ideas on Taps. So I'm from Columbus, Mississippi, born and raised, and after going to college at Millsaps and law school at the University of Wisconsin, moved back to Mississippi and worked for the Mississippi Center for Justice and did a bunch of other things. But in 2015, decided to run for district attorney because I believe that we needed to have a change in the way we approach crime in prison in Mississippi, particularly in my district. I thought that we were being too heavy-handed on sentencing and needed to look at diversion opportunities for people that were addicted to drugs and that was driving the crime, and find ways to help them get their life back on track that didn't have the collateral consequences of sending somebody to prison. And so I ran on that platform and got elected in 2015, started in 2016, and I've been in office ever since. So I deal a lot with police because all felony arrests eventually result in a review by the district attorney's office and presentation of the case to the grand jury. And so a very important part of my job is the relationship with the police and making sure that our justice system is fair and equal in its application of the law to our citizens. So I'm excited to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Claire, tell us a little bit about yourself and what are you bringing to the conversation?
Unmute.
Yeah, unmute.
Thanks, Tamika. I am happy to be a part of this conversation. I'm not sure what I bring, but I often have a lot to say. As we say in Mississippi, my people are from Tylertown, Mississippi. Been down there a long time. My dad grew up on a dairy farm. My mom's family, there were 8 brothers and sisters, and they had to help farm. And so I have that kind of background, deeply steeped in Mississippi. I went to undergraduate here at Mississippi College after graduating from public schools in Huntsville, Alabama. Then I went away to New York for law school, came back here in 1992. I've been practicing law here for 28 years. Started out in big law for just a few years, and then I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office during the Clinton administration. After that, I opened a law firm with former U.S. Attorney Brad Pygott, current federal district judge Carlton Reeves, and our other law partner, Doug Miner. An integrated law firm, integrated staff. Really was surprising how few firms there are that are integrated in that regard. And we had an interesting practice that focused on, civil rights, criminal defense. We did interesting plaintiffs work around the state. And in 2014, I was offered the opportunity to take that civil rights background and do it full time and teach students. I had gone to Sweden for a year to teach and really got the teaching bug. And so since I've been here at the University of Mississippi School of Law running the MacArthur Justice Center, we have focused entirely on civil rights litigation, focusing on criminal justice reform, looking at issues of race, poverty, criminal justice in Mississippi, litigating cases around illegal bail practices, the failure to provide counsel to poor defendants, police misconduct, jail suicides, and mental health services in prison facilities. And so we're focused on a lot of issues, including juvenile issues that are important to Mississippi. And so we're, I'm eager to have this conversation because I really do think we're moving into a next phase of really serious conversation regarding the truth about our system.
Absolutely, I agree. I'm excited about what we're going to talk about today. And so again, I appreciate you all lending your voices to this conversation. I have to point out before we begin, our Mississippi colleges and universities represented on this panel. I've heard Mississippi College, I've heard Millsap, so I've got to represent the Jackson State University.
Yeah.
So I think we're well-rounded here. Yeah. So
yeah.
Let's go ahead and dive in. I think that many of us are clear regarding the existence of systems of racial oppression. These systems have taken many forms over the years, whether we're talking about religion or healthcare, the economy or government. All these systems in some way contribute to or reinforce, we've seen, the elevating of dominant groups while also minimalizing or oppressing marginalized groups. And we can go back to the war on drugs from the 1970s and take a look at the disproportionate and negative toll it took on communities of color, disparities in the criminal justice system like we're about to talk about, the staggering stats of everything from adjudication and sentencing to jail and prison custody, parole and reentry. We've seen that people of color oftentimes come up on the short end of the stick, and these inequities do not occur by accident. So whether we're looking at over-policing and the over-representation of people of color in prisons and jails, or looking at the healthcare system and the higher rate of illness and death among people of color compared to their white counterparts, these are not, hidden facts. And so the consequences we see, for example, are those like what we're experiencing now with COVID-19 and the gripping impact it's having in communities of color. So shifting back to policing and criminal justice, when we ignore the inequities in society's institutions, it cripples the nation and our ability to have a collective, positive impact on the world and a rich, rewarding life for all citizens. So let's just start by unpacking systemic racism, right? Like how do you define systemic racism and define it in the context of policing, criminal justice, and how does it present itself in these systems? Let's start with you, Scott.
Wow, Shamika, I think you really said it all there. I don't know if I can follow that. I think that when you look at systematic racism, when it comes to policing, I think you've got to take a step back and look at the history of policing in America. If you go back to the colonial era doing research, then there wasn't really formal policing. It was really private enforcement, some volunteer work. You don't really see organized policing in America until towards, in Boston, you get some policing that's organized around shipping merchants and protecting shipping. But in the South, in the Confederacy, that most of the policing was around slave patrols. It was about making sure slaves didn't revolt against their masters, and it was about making sure that slaves that escaped were found and brought back to their masters. So that's the history of organized policing in the South. And then you go towards the later 19th century and the later 20th century. There's been a lot of reforms in policing. I mean, people think that the way we currently have policing is the way it's always been. That's actually not true. You look at, in fact, President Hoover, I read this the other day, he actually had a commission where he talked about, where he investigated the corruption in policing, basically because at that point, policing were organized by precincts, and there were political bosses that basically controlled the police, and so police might have the responsibility during Prohibition to make sure there wasn't alcohol in a particular area, while at the same time they were themselves involved in selling alcohol. So that it wasn't until that commission that we started to get professionalized police forces that were more focused in on being independent from politics and having professional responsibilities. And unfortunately, in the South, during that period of time, the police force was used, at least significantly, to enforce segregation. I mean, you can look back at, and we too often forget that history, that's not too long ago, but you look back at the 50s and 60s, the main people that fought the civil rights movement on behalf of the state during that period of time was the police. You look at Bull Connor, you look at in Selma, there's many historical examples of the police enforcing what at that point was a status quo that was unjust. And so once you look at it in that context, you look at what's happened in the modern context, and you realize there's just some systems about ways that police have performed their duties historically that has caused some disparate impact amongst minority communities. And it's not, if people look at systematic racism, they think, well, how can a system be racist? I mean, as long as the individual people aren't racist, then how can a system be racist? Well, the best example I always give when I talk about systematic racism is the way housing was done in America with redlining. I mean, FHA, a government institution, insured mortgages for banks, and they did so in a way where they basically mapped on the handbook that they gave to the banks certain areas that they would not insure. Those areas were primarily African-American areas. And so because they would not insure those mortgages, the banks obviously were hesitant to give mortgages in those areas. Well, that created a lot of home ownership in certain areas that excluded minorities. Well, that was, even if the individual banker wasn't racist or the person at FHA had what they thought were good intentions when they created that policy, the reaction of it was systematic racism because it excluded African Americans from being able to build the wealth that comes with home ownership. And so when you look at policing, we have to avoid the temptation to make it about individual people and say, how is this entity acting in a way probably based on historical practices that has disparate impacts on certain communities? Until we're honest about that conversation, as you said, Tamika, we're not going to have a police force that everybody can trust, that makes everybody feel safe, and so and treat it fairly. So that's how, I guess that's kind of what I would say about systematic racism, just to start.
Thanks for that. Cliff, what's your take? Systemic racism in policing and criminal justice. What's your take?
Yeah, so I think Scott's exactly right. We're not looking at whether or not individuals are racist, although that's very important to identify and ferret out. We're looking at the way systems operate normally, the way they were intended to operate when they were built on racist foundation and racist operation. Whether it was explicit, implicit, certainly historically it was explicit in the ways that Scott's discussed. So it's a different conversation than the conversation about individual racism. So when you start looking at it in the context of policing, we have to ask ourselves, important questions about the system, right? So who gets policed? Who are the police most interested in? Who are the people that we fear in our society? And in particular, who are the people that the majority culture fear? Those who are in positions of power and influence. How did that come to be? Scott referenced slave patrols, so you start looking at the populations that were intended to be controlled. Historically, you had this racial hierarchy where white folks are at the top of the food chain, and the fear always was, because of the substantial number of Black people in Mississippi, particularly as a result of slavery, white people knew that if these people get power, any kind of power, economic power at the polls, right, that their systems and way of life was at risk. And so there was all kinds of ways that you undertook to keep people controlled. Policing historically has been part of that. So when you look at who most often has interactions with the police, how that came to be, who becomes police officers and why they become police officers, and you ask those questions, we know we're not going to paint with a broad brush here. We know that there are some fine people who are police officers. We all know those people. Scott works with them, I know, on a daily basis. There are others who have problems, and we have to identify, but who are these people who become police officers? What conduct have we decided to criminalize and treat most harshly? So we've seen historically, for example, disparities in certain types of drugs, right? So cheap drugs that are readily available in poor inner city communities have very harsh sentences, where drugs that are more likely used by wealthy people or white people have much less harsh sentences. So during the Obama administration, the federal government recognized that and made some significant changes. So I think if we're honest about structurally how the system was built, what were the underlying foundations, and let's talk specifically about Mississippi, what population in the state with the highest percentage of African Americans by far, really, than any other state, what population have we tried to control? And then we have to talk about, and I'm sure we'll get into that tonight, the implications of that on all these other structures. The last thing I'll say about it, and I'm not trying to be flippant on the topic because it did say on tap. So I will just say that, we have to look at the connection between policing and the issues that we're talking about and all the other topics that Scott began to touch on, right? So it's access to early childhood education, healthcare, housing, money, jobs, wage disparity, mental health care, drug and alcohol treatment. All of those things are criminal justice issues ultimately, and they're all places where we see systemic racism that, Stokely Carmichael talked about as early as the late 60s. So there's this interconnectedness when we're talking about systemic racism, but that's my take on the criminal justice piece. You have to look at why it exists, and I think who we're trying to control.
I agree. Thank you both for that. When we use a historic lens to understand the systems that anchor our nation, right? That gives us a lot of context to understanding and unpacking how that system moves and influences and drives, right, everything we do. And so my next question then is, if we're talking the difference between systemic racism, right? And I think you all made it very clear about, that difference with individual racism, right? An individual's perspective and how that looks different from a system that impacts, people, a broad, spread of folks. How do we know the difference? Well, at what point would you say the system itself becomes a racist one? Keeping in mind that some might argue that the systems were built in a racist ideology. So at what point do you begin to kind of see the system itself becoming racist? What are some of those cues?
Yeah, so I'll jump in. Let me give you an example of when you start thinking about the difference between a racist system and kind of racist individual cops and how that system becomes racist. Let's take a hypothetical situation. Schools in Jackson, Mississippi. What we know is white folks and black folks use drugs at about the same rate, right? Same incident. But we also know that African Americans are prosecuted for drug crimes at a 10-to-1 ratio over white folks. And so let's say that you're a good-natured police officer, right? You were raised right. Your mom and daddy didn't raise you to be a racist, at least not explicitly. And you're trying to do the right things. And the chief tells you you're on drug patrol and you're going to go where we've been going for years. You're going to go over there to neighborhoods around Lanier High School. And because after school at Lanier, we see drug activity. So you need to go to Lanier and check out what's going on over there. That's a routine place that we patrol, right? On the other side of town at Jackson Prep, if the data holds up, and I think it does, the drugs are used at the same rate, you would expect to see the same type of drug use in and around Jackson Prep as you would in and around Lanier. What happens historically, we know, is that the police officers aren't at Jackson Prep. And that police officer, this good police officer that we're talking about in this hypothetical, he's over at Lanier, and sure enough, he finds some kids who are smoking weed. And they're making some stops in the neighborhoods around Lanier. And that behavior at Jackson Prep, right, is characterized as kids being kids, heading off to be part of Sigma Chi at Ole Miss next year. We all know folks smoke a little weed. Let's don't make a big federal case out of it. That arrest at Lanier, right, is something very different, right? We're talking about somebody who's headed down the road to a life of crime, and we've got to nip it in the bud and get it early. And this police officer of goodwill, non-racist police officer, is caught up in a system where day in and day out, he's arresting people. He's bringing cases to Scott saying, Scott, you got to prosecute these people. These kids are smoking weed over here. We got to stop them where they are in their tracks. And there's nobody over at Jackson Prep. And so what I'd say is when you start thinking about when does a system become racist, it's when do you have enforcement and outcomes that disproportionately affect certain populations because of their racial identity, the color of their skin. When police officers start setting up roadblocks outside Latino workplaces because they've decided on their own to do this discretionary act to enforce immigration laws because they have strongly held beliefs about immigration. When you start seeing that transition to disproportionate impact built on the history that we've already talked about, we get to where we are right now. That's my kind of example of how it happens. Scott, I don't know if you agree with that. You probably see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the important thing to point out is that a lot of times it'll be Black police officers involved in this. I mean, there'll be Black police chiefs, Black sergeants, Black lieutenants, Black police officers that have a, they're dealing with the same structures and reality that you just described, that historically certain neighborhoods are supposed to be policed and other neighborhoods aren't supposed to be policed, that have a disparate impact. And too often that's not addressed in a way and acknowledged in a way that can be corrected. So, that's the important thing to point out. It's not always individual racism, it's systematic racism in the way we're described, because it could be Black people doing it who think, I would never want to be over policed, or I never want to police certain neighborhoods differently. But some of it is just, we have to be frank about who we care about politically. Because some of it is certain neighborhoods, like maybe Jackson Academy, I think you brought up that example. Their parents are probably not going to tolerate their neighborhood being policed in that way. If there's a bunch of arrests for marijuana, a bunch of arrests for cocaine or pills, there's going to be a reaction politically that's going to hold those police officers accountable to the mayor, to the city council. Whereas for whatever reason, when there's over policing of other poorer neighborhoods, there's not that same concern politically about the repercussions of that. And that's one thing we've got to do to empower voters in all communities. They need to know that ultimately the police are accountable in a political system where they can drive the change that's necessary. So that's another thing I always tell communities: you can drive change. In a city like Jackson, the community can drive change, but it is very difficult. And what we have to do, and I think Cliff really hit on it, is that a lot of this is implicit biases that are given to us through the media and through historical lenses. Unfortunately, the profile of a young Black male, 16 to 25 in America, is very negative. Especially if they're in a certain area and they're dressed a certain way, that most people, not just police officers, most people are going to have assumptions about that person that are not positive. They're very negative. And they don't have those same stereotypes about a young white person, 18 to 25, in a different type of neighborhood. They have a different type of stereotype about that person. Well, in policing, the problem is if those stereotypes are informing your decisions, not only is it going to cause inequities in how you treat people, but it's actually going to make that community less safe, because some of the poorer neighborhoods have crime issues because they have the least amount of trust in police. And so they don't give statements of when they see crime. They don't cooperate because that's not something that's viewed as positive in the neighborhood because of the negative stereotypes that those communities have about police. And so that's one thing that we don't talk enough about, is that these systematic racism actually makes solving crimes and making communities safe more difficult.
Thank you. That's beautifully said, both of you. I really want to point out, especially how you've colored the conversation around the power of systems. And so what I'm hearing is, as systems function, they shape and color the cultural expectations and cultural norms of the communities where they exist, right? So now if we have, for example, policing happening at Lanier High School, then now we have the expectation that something's going on over there, right? Something bad must be happening. And then that becomes part of the fabric of your normal everyday living, that the police needs to be in a certain part of town because that's just where they need to be. And we stop thinking that that's a problem. We don't even begin to ask the questions anymore about, is there a heavy police presence in other schools, in other communities, in the same way they exist in certain communities? We stop asking those questions because now it's a norm. And so I think that is the power of systems that we have to raise to the surface of the conversation, right? Because that becomes our normal, our expectation. And it can also inoculate stereotypes, right? And in inoculating stereotypes, begin to inoculate the isms that we're concerned about, whether it's racism or classism or sexism or whatever that is, right? So I think all those things are really important. As we're talking about systems, right? Systems operate in a way oftentimes that's really invisible. The average American citizen doesn't always know the inner workings of the criminal justice system or the healthcare system. Many times people get that experience and some of that knowledge when they have an encounter with that system in an intimate way. And so oftentimes systems feel big, they feel invisible, they feel impenetrable. And well, where like you can't penetrate that system, right? If you don't know how to navigate. So what steps can we take to start addressing systemic racism, right? If it's moving in a way that's often invisible, that's often ignored, is ingrained in the culture, how can we begin to address systemic racism in policing and criminal justice systems? I'll start with you, Scott.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the things that we have to do to make progress in this area is we have to have a lot more transparency when it comes to policing and prosecution. I mean, I think most people will be shocked at what a black box policing is in not just Mississippi, but in the country. You know, how many stops and interactions are the police having in certain neighborhoods? Who are those people? What are their demographics? How many times did it lead to an arrest? What type of charges are brought against that person? What's the conviction? How much time do they get? A lot of that really is not accessible in a way that a consumer can understand. And by consumer, I mean voter. And so that's the first step I think that we've got to take that's very necessary is we have to just shine a light on policing, because until we do that, we can't really make progress because people are able to really hide behind that darkness. That's an important step. The next step that I feel like is important is we've got to champion the voices of people that have been impacted by the system. And I mean that not only people that have been incarcerated, but also the voices of victims, because the stereotype about the average victim in Mississippi is very different than the actual reality. The average victim of a gun violent crime in Mississippi is somebody between the age of 18 and 24 that typically knows the person that shot and killed them. Either they knew each other or there's some relationship there. And so the people that are actually dealing with that, they're not driving policy enough. Too much appears that there are people that are actually not the victims of these type of horrendous crimes really driving the narrative as to how we should handle it. And I think that's something else that we need to really address is we got to make sure we're honest about who are the actual victims of most crime in Mississippi versus the who's driving the narrative.
Cliff?
I think Scott touched on this some. I think data is really important. Good data, reliable data. We have very poor data collection systems in Mississippi. So sometimes you start talking about anecdotes and people want to push back against you. And I think the capacity to collect data, to process it, to digest it, and to present it in a way that people can understand is really important. I think we have to punish bad behavior. I think people have to be held accountable, and that includes judges and district attorneys and lawyers and police chiefs. We have to call out behavior that we think is unacceptable and identify it. We in Mississippi have the second highest incarceration rate in the country. We have to ask really serious questions about our addiction to locking people up. Why is it that we send so many people to jail here? Are we morally inferior to the rest of the country and Mississippians are just a bunch of criminals? Or is something else going on here? And there's no reason that we have to have an incarceration rate that's off the charts. It doesn't make good sense. It doesn't make us safer. So I think we have to rethink those issues. I think we have to start having conversations about policing generally in our opportunities to, I'm going to use the catchphrase because it's people recognize it, to defund the police in the sense of thinking about what the appropriate role of policing is generally, and whether there are other people better equipped to deal with certain behaviors. We've put a lot on police, right? We ask them to be school counselors. We ask them to be drug and alcohol addiction counselors. We ask them to be social workers for homeless people. We ask sheriffs to take care of people with mental illness in their jails. And so the
and we don't train any of them for any of that.
they're not. Scott, to your point, the biggest allies we had in our litigation around mental health services were sheriffs who said, look, Cliff, I'm not trained or equipped to take care of some guy for 3 or 4 years in my jail who has profound mental health issues. So police officers have a lot on them. And so we thrust them into these situations where there are real experts who know how to deal with people with mental illness, with addiction. Then we start thinking about what would the world look like if we dealt with root causes early, right? We identify those kids who need mental health services, those teenagers who have drug and alcohol problems, and we have community-based mental health and community-based free drug and alcohol services. I guarantee you if we took that seriously, then this police force, this big militarized police force will shrink. Then we'll have a small police force that deals with the most serious of situations. And then we'll have a group of experts who can deal with a variety of other issues. And if we get started, with people early enough in life, we'll have fewer issues generally. But that takes big imagination, right? To get outside of the status quo. And I'll say this, and I'll stop here. White folks tend to hold on to the status quo because that's what we know and that's what's worked for us. That's what was set up for us to control certain people and to make us feel safe. We feel differently about law enforcement than a lot of our Black friends do. So part of this is going to be, talking to people, and in particular white folks, about the notion of thinking in a hopeful way, speak prophetically, and not shrink when people feel discombobulated by this conversation of, the world's going to change and it's going to be chaos. Really spend the time, get face to face with people and explain to them that we all want the same thing, right? We want a safe neighborhood, good school to send our kids, a decent paying job, and a nice vacation once in a while, right? Wherever you live, we want the same things. We got to get people in that headspace. Yeah,
I agree. And that's a perfect pivot to the next question where I want to go with this. And that is law enforcement and the criminal justice system are supposed to create a just society and to make citizens feel safe. However, for many people of color, justice and safety are not characteristics that they associate with the policing and criminal justice systems. So how do we reconcile the fact that these systems represent safety to some and danger to others? So I'm gonna start with you, Cliff, since you kind of brought us into that conversation, then I'll go to Scott.
I don't know how dramatic the change would have to be as a white guy in Mississippi for me to opine as to what it would take for Black folks to feel safer about police. I don't know that I can speak to that. I can talk about what I see with my clients of color, with Latino immigrants who feel very vulnerable as a result of aggressive policing by local officers. I know people who've been hurt. I know people who live in fear, and it makes me sad. The reality is, we have to, and I'm not saying this just because Scott's on the panel. We have to elect people like Scott Colomb as DAs. We have to rethink the notion that a district attorney, every district attorney race in Mississippi has to be about who's the toughest and who's going to lock them up and throw away the key. And that's the only way you can win a sheriff's race or a DA's race in Mississippi, right? It's a contest to talk about who's toughest on crime. And I think that's in white and Black jurisdictions that happens, right? Because everybody wants to feel safe. We have to rethink the role of judges and lawyers and DAs and police officers as we, one, confess our failure, right? What we're doing is not working. I don't think people view this as some sort of success to celebrate. And then we have to, as Scott said, engage affected communities, make them feel like they have a voice. I don't think we can change the way they feel about the system unless they believe they are a part of the system, and unless in reality they are a part of the system. And I'll tell you, that's, I've failed in that regard. The old structure of like the civil rights lawyer who stays up at the law school, drops down, files a case, goes to the courthouse and never meets the people, right? That's a model that I've been a part of, where you don't really get into those communities. I think all of us are realizing that that's not effective. So I think it has something to do with kind of capacity building and empowering people, giving them a voice, and then being willing to change the way we do things. People like me being willing to change the way we do things. And Scott's probably learned some of those lessons as well.
Scott?
Absolutely. I think that, that's a very important question you asked, Tamika. I think I'm going to tell a personal story that I think can highlight the difference in using police power to have power over somebody versus make them safe. So like most African Americans that I know that are male across the country, I had a bad interaction with a police officer. One time when I was in New Orleans, one night, my cousin, I was a lawyer at this point. My cousin, I guess, petted a horse, one of the police horses. And then the police arrested him for that. So I went to the police officer and I asked him, as a lawyer thinking I have the right to ask the police officer why they arrested my cousin, I asked him, why'd you arrest my cousin? And he said, if you ask me another fucking question, I'm gonna arrest you. And I said in response, you're gonna arrest me for asking you a question? You're arrested. Now, was that about safety at that moment? Now, if the person who went through it, who had to spend the night in the New Orleans Parish Jail and had to bond out the next day, I can assert a lawyer, my cousin's a very successful business person. I can tell you we were not a danger to anybody. We were not a danger to police. We weren't committing any offenses. My cousin, maybe you shouldn't have pet the horse. He certainly didn't mean any ill intent from it.
Hey, Scott.
Yeah.
I've petted lots of horses in the world.
Oh, there you go. But anyway, but I could tell the reason he arrested me in particular, I don't know about my cousin, but the reason he arrested me was because it was about power. It was about the idea that I had the audacity to ask him about the charge. Now, of course, that charge for me was, I fought the charge. The charge was dismissed. It's not on my record. Didn't impact me other than that one night and having to pay to get a lawyer. But I always ask myself, what about the people that are not in my situation, right? They don't have parents that are lawyers. They don't have access to money to fight for themselves. They couldn't bond out. Maybe they spent 2 or 3 days in jail. And that was all about power. And I just really don't understand when police officers, I don't know if when individual police officers do that, they understand the negative consequence that has on people. Because of my position, I've gained a lot of strong relationships with police officers, and I've got a lot of them that I think a lot of. So I don't hold that one bad incident against other police officers. But if I know other people that they've had so many bad interactions like that, they hold it against everybody. So we have to go back to the premise of it's got to be about me making people safe versus me exerting my power over you. And if you look at what happened in Minneapolis with the murder of George Floyd, you can't watch that video and not determine that was about power. It wasn't about safety at that point. It was about power. And our ignoring that, our communities lying about that, being something that we need to correct, that had consequences. The consequence of that was George Floyd's murder, and we've had one of the biggest outbursts of protests in our country's history. So we've got to be honest about that, and it's got to be something we correct. Can I make a final point about defunding? Because I see there's a lot of people asking questions about that, and it's something that I think we got to be careful. One, the language is terrible politically. I mean, if you're trying to achieve the goal, I know it feels good to just, this is my language, I'm going to fight for that, but it's just not great, because people typically don't like messaging that's about taking something away. They like messaging that's about offering something new. So I think that that's one thing. But we also have to be clear that defunding in itself is not the solution. I mean, as someone who lived in Jackson for a long period of time, I think there's an argument to make that that's a pretty defunded police department based on what the officers make, how many officers they have, particularly if you look at their prosecution. I mean, the amount of prosecutors they have, they've got maybe 14, 15 prosecutors. Well, they've got way more murders than a city like Denver, but Denver's got like 100 prosecutors. So the reality is just defunding the police force without funding the things that Cliff is talking about doesn't solve the problem. It might actually exacerbate it. So, and then because if you exacerbate the problem, then you go back into the bubble of, well, this is why we need more police, because this is the only way we can make communities safe. And so we've got to be honest and say, when we're talking about reprioritizing funding, we need to make sure that we're talking about providing funding for the things that Cliff's talking about: mental health services, drug and alcohol counseling, violence intervention, people that can actually identify potential conflict and try to resolve it, restorative justice. Those type of things are going to cost money. Not doing anything is not going to make our community safer. We've got to start building a new model, and and that's where what Cliff said is so important. We've got to convince all stakeholders that can be successful, because the cheapest thing to do is to just cage everybody and have terrible conditions and not worry about it. But eventually, like Cliff pointed out in his editorial, eventually you always have to be accountable. At some point, the federal government is going to come in, they're going to take it over, they're going to make us spend the money, we're going to have supervision for a long period of time. So we got to stop ignoring these problems because they have consequences.
Definitely. Let's follow this pathway now towards some of these questions, like you said, that we're starting to get in. Questions around defunding the police or police unions. What does that mean? I do want to pause for a second on a particular question about teaching the public about the history of policing. And I know that both of you have some background in instruction. And so when we think about how do we educate as it relates to how systems impact people, how do we teach the public about the history of policing and systemic racism in the policing system? Where does that start? If you want to get down to the nuts and bolts of logistics, do we start with very young children, right? Or do we table that conversation until our kids are in college? And I believe that that's a really important point, because a lot of parents have to start having conversations with their children of color about how to safely interact with the police. And so what's your take about education and educating the public about police?
Well, you know what's interesting to me in my class, Tamika, my clinic is 8 law students per semester, and by design, it's usually 4 African-American students and 4 other students, because I think it's important, at least in one class in your law school experience, to have these conversations where there's some balance of influence and voice. And I think it's been a really important part of my class. And one of the things that I think surprises my Black friends, and it is how little white folks in Mississippi know about the heaviness of conversation with your kid about police officers. And I have had white students in my class, and you might think it naive, and I think it's interesting though, who have gotten emotional when an African-American classmate will talk about the first time their daddy talked about how you act when a police officer stops you. My white students, many of them, of course, they've never had that conversation. Of course, they've never, with their parents. They see the pain in their friends' eyes when they talk about that conversation. And then they tell a story about how they've been stopped. I think always the power of storytelling in education is really important, right? And I think we do have to figure out where we go from the days. I'm 53, so I was born in 1967. I grew up at a time where we talked about officer friendly, right? And so officer friendly came to school, and my parents told me that if you're ever lost, if there's anything wrong, you can always go to a police officer because they're there to help you. If ever you need anything, go to police officer. And they come to your school, and they were, some nice person came and talked about how we want to be here for you. And then I think when my kids were young, they had police officers come and talk about drugs. And they didn't have police officers in my school, my kids' school, assigned to the school. So that was a different experience. But I do think we have to talk, Tamika, early with kids about who these people are. I don't think that you necessarily have conversations about systemic racism with third graders, but I think the truth about our country, one of the big failures, right, is the refusal to make any concession about our racist past. We all talk about South Africa, right? And we talk about apartheid. It's part of who they are. And this small group of white folks dominate Black South Africans and how terrible it was and the reality of Mandela's efforts. But we don't want to say that out loud here, as evidenced by our uprising about Confederate monuments and the resistance to their removal, as evidenced by conversations about the flag. I think we've got to figure out how we speak truthfully about our past without making people feel like they have to reject their parents and grandparents and the things they love about Mississippi. My experience is white folks and Black folks alike who live in Mississippi are here because they care about the place. They don't want to tear it down. They don't want to turn it upside down. And so I think it's hard, but I think there's space for it. And I think it's important. And I do think we have to start early. But what I wonder is, what are we as a group willing to say out loud about the truth of our history? And I don't know the answer to that. That's harder than I thought it would be.
Scott, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just think that's so important because, and what's interesting to me is I find it really troubling when certain people, certain Americans claim that being honest about a history is not patriotic. I mean, and that's kind of the ploy they use to avoid any criticism is like, you're not being patriotic. You hate America. Listen, I love America. I love Mississippi. I'm 7th generation Mississippi, right? After high school, after law school, I did very well in law school. I could have went anywhere in the country. I came back in Mississippi. So I love Mississippi. Nobody loves Mississippi, I feel like, more than me. They might love it as much, but not more. So, but with that love, just like my father loves me, but he also criticized me when I was wrong. And so that's the thing, we have to be honest. And the other thing that's strange is we need to maybe I don't know, Cliff, I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this. We need to make clear that racism was not unique to America, right? I'm reading a book now, a novel about how Koreans during World War II and prior to that, when Japan basically colonized Korea, how they were treated so poorly by Japanese people, how they were consistently discriminated against, how there basically was a caste system that applied a bunch of negative stereotypes about them to justify oppressing them. Well, I mean, you can go to, I taught in Guyana, South America for a year. There was a lot of friction between the Indian Guyanese and the African Guyanese about these type of issues. You can go to India now. So it's not, this human impulse to treat other people differently for your own benefit. It's not America. It's not unique to America. There's historical examples throughout world history. But the countries, and this is why I think America has the opportunity to be the leader, because we are so multicultural. That's the advantage we have of a Japan or a Germany. We are a very diverse country. That is to our benefit. We have to take that and use that to advance humanity in a way that really has never existed, where we actually can get beyond these really superficial characteristics and get down to actually be in a place in a country that lives up to our amazing Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, the ideals behind it. And Mississippi can lead the way in that because we are the most diverse state. Well, I guess California is a little bit more diverse, but we have the highest percent of African Americans. So we can lead the way in that. I don't know why we wouldn't honor that and fight for that. But it seems like we don't want to. We want to basically ignore it. One
quick thing I'll tell you about my class, and I'm interested in that too, Scott. Like, why is it so hard to say that? And I come at from a theological perspective, so I'll use the term. Why would the sin of racism be, unique to Mississippi or America? And why can't we recognize that part of the human condition is to be fearful of others and people you don't understand or people who are different? So one of the things I say to my white students, and sometimes it's hard for them to hear initially, particularly when we're talking about implicit bias, I'd say, look, you're in this really diverse class, right? And I know you're afraid to say the wrong thing. You're going to say Afro-American accidentally, or you're going to say blacks plural instead of black singular, and then you're going to be called a racist, and that's the worst thing can ever happen to you. I said, here's the truth, and hear me from a position of caring about you. if you were born and raised in the South and you're white, you're probably a racist. A little bit, right? I mean, you were every night on the 10 p.m., 6 p.m. news, the first 6 minutes is just this parade of 17-year-old Black kids who you're told to be afraid of. And you've grown up in these systems that we've talked about earlier. And I'm not trying to let them off the hook and say you're a victim of your society, but at the same time, what I'm saying is, rather than run from that notion that I struggle and that I have blind spots, and I, Cliff Johnson, have them. I see them. Things happen in me, as I'm sure they do with you, Scott, and you, Tamika. Things come up in my head, and I'm like, I wish that wasn't there. And I have work to do. But you're right. There's a resistance to that we have to get over, to say, I'm carrying around this culture in me, and I was raised in a country built on racism, in a state with a bad history on race. So the notion that I have racist tendencies, thoughts, sexist tendencies, thoughts as a white male in Mississippi, a straight white male in Mississippi, I got some stuff that I got to work on. And for some reason, that's hard. And I bet you see it, Tamika, at Delta State, trying to get those students to that place where they can have that conversation. It's hard. And I think we can work on that. And I think we can help each other in that regard. It's a good point, Scott. I like that point. Yeah.
That kind of pivots me a little bit to one of the questions that we received online, where someone asked, what is racism, right? What is it? And I want to throw that out to you all, but I want to weigh in a little bit on that by pointing out that a lot of times we want to act racist, but not be called a racist, right? And so the definition of racism gets cloudy. And so whenever we talk about racism, from a psychological standpoint, we're talking about this assumption that there is a racial group that is better than another. And different people have different levels of awareness of those assumptions within themselves, if they exist, right? So some people have a proud perspective about their thoughts as it relates to minorities or people who are white. And then there are others who just don't have an awareness maybe of, like you talked about, Cliff, that implicit bias. And we have to be intentional in pushing back against messages that come to us daily via the media, social media, just cultural nuances that elevates one group above another. And it requires this constant awareness to recognize those things. And we have to teach our kids how to recognize those things. So whenever we talk about racism, then I position that it's the assumption or belief that there is a racial group that is superior to others. How do you guys think about that?
To me, I couldn't say any better than you just said it. So I'm gonna leave it with what you said.
The one thing I would say, because I don't want white folks to do this thing we do where we say Black people are racist too. I think power matters, right? So I think we have to be honest about the fact of if a white person takes the position that they're superior, if white superiority is deeply ingrained with them and they continue to oppress people who've been historically oppressed and marginalized, to me, that feels different, I'll be honest, than if someone who's been the victim of that marginalization and that oppression has negative feelings toward their oppressor. So I think that that's a conversation that we can have, but I don't want to draw a false equivalence, right, to people with power and privilege who continue to oppress a people is the same as people who've been oppressed having negative feelings about their oppressors. That ain't the same. But as I said before, I think we all have things we can work on. So in the interest of equal time, I'll say my African-American students ain't great on LGBTQ stuff, right? We all got stuff. They ain't great, right? I mean, we got issues we all dealing with. So, but on this issue of racism, right, I want to make that distinction between the oppressor and the oppressed. I think it's important.
I agree. And I think language is important, especially when you talk about, Cliff, racism versus moving into discrimination, right? And the power that comes with being able to discriminate, right, based on your racist thoughts. And so let's take one more question before we try to wrap it up just a little bit. There's a question around studies on the negative impact of systemic racism on Mississippi's economy. Can either of you speak a little bit to what you might understand to be some of the impact racist systems that they have had for the state economically?
I don't know of any studies directly that answer that question. I can just offer anecdotal evidence of our lack of progress economically compared to the rest of the country. And I think that any person that's being honest would say that that has something to do with our funding of our schools and the way we fund them, and how some of the poorer areas are not funded to the level they need to be for those students to be successful. So, but I don't know any specific studies. I do want to ask, I saw a question about police unions, and that's something that comes up a lot nationally. We don't have public sector unions in Mississippi. Cliff, correct me if I'm wrong. So we don't have any police unions. We don't have any teacher unions. So
that's
not
association, but not the unions in the traditional sense.
Yeah. So police associations, I don't. It's someone who's run for office twice now and follows a lot of the district attorney races. They don't tend to be, the associations, because they're not unionized that same way, they don't tend to be active politically in the DA races or sheriff races, at least that I've seen. They may be active in other places, but across the state, but I haven't seen them have the same political power that you see like in Philadelphia or Chicago or New York, just because they're not politically organized like that.
On the money issue, I think one of the things I want to get back to the point of this incredibly high incarceration rate we have. So we're the poorest state in the country with the second highest incarceration rate in the country. So this really disproportionately large corrections budget, and that really hurts us. And if you ask counties about the cost of the number of people they keep pre-trial in their jails, it's expensive, right? So this enforcement mentality costs you money. And then when you talk about disproportionate impact on communities of color, for example, African Americans make up 38% of the state, but they make up 57 to 60% of those people who are in our prisons. You look at people locked up, you look at the number of people who are disenfranchised, you look at the impact of the have you ever been convicted of a felony box, right, on your employment application, the number of licenses you're no longer eligible to get because you've been convicted of a crime, the impact on Black wealth in Mississippi, the fact that, for every $100 of wealth white families have in America, Black families have $5, right? So you have to look at how law enforcement and criminalization of behavior and control impacts those things. And look, when you keep a population down, that's not just a drag on that community, right? It's a drag on the entire economy of the state. We can't not say this. Young people leaving our state in droves, running out of Mississippi at record rates. We have the highest per capita out migration of young people. All of this conversation is a part of them getting the heck out of Dodge.
So this has really just been a fantastic conversation. It's so much to unpack in a conversation like this. It's so many layers. But what I think is really important is that folks be brave enough to have the honest conversation, and to have that honest conversation, not just with people who think just like you, but to have a conversation and dialogue with people who think differently from you, but be resolved to at least agree to disagree, right? To disagree amicably, but to agree on being unified and doing what's best for the community, doing what's best for the state, and doing what's best for the nation, right? So, and thinking of ourselves in the shoes of people who are disenfranchised. All of us want the American dream. All of us want what's best for our kids. All of us want to not go to jail, right? All of us want to feel safe in our communities. And so when we think of it in that way, then it's easy to see how folks who are underserved and folks who are marginalized and folks who are disenfranchised have some frustration with the systems that bind their ability to live the American dream. And people act out against those systems in ways that they define. We cannot tell people how to express their frustration. What we have to do is start trying to have conversation around where's the kindling to the fire, and how do we begin to dismantle those barriers for people who otherwise could live the American dream. So I'm just gonna stop here and give each of you an opportunity to have any last parting words before we kick it back over to the Humanities Council team. I'll start with you, Scott, and then we'll end with you, Cliff.
Well, I just want to say I've really enjoyed the conversation. I'll tell you, Tamika, you really did a great job moderating. I thought that your comments were really just very informative, and really honestly, you didn't need me because you had you, and then you had the Michael Jordan of criminal justice reform in Mississippi, Cliff Johnson, as your sidekick. Really just respect and admire Cliff so much. I mean, if you hadn't read his column about the veto of Senate Bill 2123, which was a really, I think, policy decision that's going to have really negative repercussions, you should read it, because he basically is telling you what's going to happen if we continue to do nothing about over incarceration and the terrible conditions of our prison system. I'm proud to be a part of it. Hope everybody enjoyed it. I like to tweet a lot, so follow me on Twitter, Scott Colon. Scott spelled the normal way, Colon, C-O-L-O-M, and hope to see everybody soon.
Thanks, Scott. Cliff?
Yeah, so I know it's going to seem like a love fest between me and Scott, but one of the things I'll say is, no, I mean, I want to end with a hopeful word, and I'm hopeful. I choose to be hopeful. I think people are finding a voice who haven't had a voice historically, and that's nothing but good news. I mean, I think people who've been marginalized and silenced are recognizing that they can be heard. And I think the presence of a Scott Colon as a district attorney, if you want to talk about things that should make you hopeful, you have Scott, who's been doing smart things. You have his friend, my friend, Jody Owens down in Hinds County, this notion of new kind of progressive minded folks who will take the law seriously and if you do bad, they'll do what they got to do. But at the same time, they're thoughtful, they're looking big picture. So I think what I would say is, I think we're going to be okay. I think we need to get to know each other still. I still don't think we know each other very well. I think we need to eat in each other's homes more often. I think we need to take the time to hear each other in the way that Tamika challenged us to do. And I think if we do that, we'll recognize that we have so much more in common than that divides us, and that Mississippi can be better. And my whole goal in this, and I think for everybody on this panel, my whole goal is that we're just better, and I think we can be. So I remain hopeful.
Thank you again. And again, everybody, this was our first virtual Ideas on Tap. And I'm going to swing it back over to the Mississippi Humanities Council to tell you guys a little bit more about how to tune in to our next conversations. Bring a drink, as our guest did today. Relax, have an open mind, and join us at our next discussion. Caroline?
Tamika, Scott, Cliff, thank y'all so much for participating. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for being here. To all of our audience who's tuning in on Facebook, thank you for tuning in. I know there were some technical glitches at the beginning, so thanks for bearing with us. For those of you who have never tuned into one of these programs before, this is Ideas on Tap. It's our monthly happy hour discussion program, which Cliff modeled so well with his beer. I actually failed to bring a drink. So it's where we encourage people to come together, to have a drink, and to have thoughtful, civil conversations on important issues. So if you're just now catching this for the first time, I encourage you to like us on Facebook. You can go to our website and sign up for our monthly newsletter to learn more about us and who we are and the other work that we do at the Humanities Council. This has been recorded. This program has been recorded. It'll be on our Facebook page, so you can go back and watch it. It will also be on our YouTube page, and so we'll link to it there as well. Again, thank you to everybody for participating tonight. We will be back in August, on August 11th, to continue the conversation. We will be talking about systemic racism in housing and education. So we encourage you all to mark August 11th from 5:30 to 7 on your calendars. And we'll be posting more information about it on our website and on our Facebook page. So we encourage you to tune in there. Thank you so much for joining in tonight. Hope you have a great night and a good rest of the week. And we will see you all in August.